The initial weeks of Trump's second administration have been defined by a wave of highly regressive criminal justice policies, closely aligning with the objectives outlined in the Project 2025 agenda. Donald Trump has issued executive orders to reinstate federal prison contracts with private corporations, lift the federal moratorium on the death penalty once again, and impose harsh prison conditions on individuals whose sentences were commuted by Joe Biden just before leaving office. As foreshadowed by his campaign rhetoric, his policies have overwhelmingly targeted immigrants, with directives aimed at increasing criminal prosecutions, expanding detention facilities, and deploying military resources to facilitate what he has vowed will be the largest deportation program in American history. While Trump falsely portrays those being targeted as violent criminals, threatening public safety, immigration and customs enforcement, ICE arrests have exceeded 1,000 per day in some instances, with little transparency regarding who is being detained and why. Despite his aggressive, tough-on-crime stance, one of Trump's first actions in office was issuing blanket pardons for nearly 1,600 individuals facing serious felony charges or convictions related to the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol, including those who assaulted Capitol police officers attempting to maintain order. In recent weeks, disturbing details have surfaced about some of the pardoned rioters, with several facing new criminal charges, including domestic violence and sexual assault. Trump's willingness to pardon his political allies, many of whom fall into the very category of violent criminals he claims to be cracking down on, exposes the hypocrisy of his administration's approach to public safety. His true focus is not crime prevention, but rather the punishment and exclusion of political adversaries and marginalized communities, particularly Black and brown populations. At its core, Trump and his party's ideology is one of disposability, advancing the interests of right-wing corporate elites and white nationalist allies by criminalizing, detaining, deporting, and even eliminating those they deem undesirable. To put it bluntly, Trump is now violently pursuing, rounding up and disappearing immigrants, the majority not charged with any criminal offense, while right-wing loyalists convicted and sentenced for violent felonies against the country are released and celebrated. In short, the Trump criminal justice agenda is merely a front. Considering the Republican Party's near-absolute devotion to law and order politics, it is darkly ironic how much of Trump's anti-immigrant crackdown is flagrantly unconstitutional. Most notably, his attempt to unilaterally amend the Constitution by executive order to end birthright citizenship, and his recent horrifying suggestion that incarcerated Americans may be transported to what would effectively be a penal colony in El Salvador. Trump also suggested that he plans to expand Guantanamo Bay, which the Center for Constitutional Rights describes as a global symbol and site of lawlessness, torture, and racism, into a migrant detention center for 30,000 people. The truth is clear. The president is using the blunt instruments of the criminal legal system to punish and isolate vulnerable people, while simultaneously trying to avoid legal oversight and flout the protections guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. Why else would his political appointees, like his border czar, Tom Homan, claim that Know Your Rights education is nothing more than a guide on how to escape arrest? No serious public officials would suggest that informing people about their constitutional rights is somehow impeding enforcement of the law, unless they are trying to hide the flagrant illegality and cruelty of their own policies. Viewing Trump's January 6th pardons alongside his broader disregard for the law and the Constitution, combined with his aggressive criminalization policies, highlights the stark reality of a two-tier justice system. While Trump's political allies who engaged in violent acts are swiftly absolved through mass clemency, peaceful pro-Palestine student protesters without citizenship status face expedited deportation. During his campaign, Trump even vowed to deploy the military against those opposing his agenda. His administration's crackdown on dissent is not new. Since 2017, at least 21 states have enacted laws restricting or criminalizing protests, primarily in response to movements advocating for Black Lives Matter, environmental justice, and Palestinian self-determination. This uneven enforcement reflects the broader realities of the criminal legal system, where outcomes are shaped by class, race, and gender. With Illinois being the only state to have fully abolished cash bail, most wealthy defendants can simply pay for their freedom, while poor individuals endure months or even years in often inhumane jail conditions without a conviction. As extensive research has shown, Black people continue to be policed and incarcerated at disproportionately higher rates than white people. However, despite the reflexive responses of liberal politicians and commentators, this is not the moment to call for the incarceration of January 6 defendants, push for restrictions on pardon power, or pretend that expanding the carceral system will address its systemic brutality. History has made it clear that demanding harsher punishments in response to white supremacist violence ultimately harms communities of color the most, precisely because they have always been the primary targets of the criminal legal system. When prosecutors gain more power, they wield it against Black and brown people and the working class. Even hate crime laws, ostensibly designed to combat white supremacy and bigotry, have been disproportionately used to criminalize Black individuals. In the era of mass incarceration, Democrats have largely responded to Republican law and order rhetoric by embracing similar punitive approaches, seeking to demonstrate their own toughness on crime. Rather than championing the widespread calls for racial justice that followed George Floyd's murder in 2020, the party has retreated from meaningful criminal justice reform in recent years. The 2024 Democratic platform marked a reversal on several prior commitments, failing to oppose the death penalty, pledging increased police funding, and omitting any mention of mass incarceration. From New York to Chicago, local Democratic leaders have caved to right-wing fear-mongering, rolling back modest reforms and expanding surveillance and incarceration rather than standing by proven, data-driven policies that enhance public health and safety, such as bail reform, reduced prosecutions, and drug decriminalization. Instead of distinguishing themselves from Republicans, Democrats have mirrored their policies, embracing a self-defeating strategy. A recent example of this bipartisan embrace of carceral policies came last month when dozens of congressional Democrats joined Republicans in passing the harsh Laken-Riley Act, which grants ICE expanded authority to deport non-citizens based solely on accusations rather than convictions. Within the next month, the HALT Fentanyl Act is also expected to pass with bipartisan support, having already garnered 98 Democratic votes in the House. Echoing the failures of the war on drugs in the 1970s, this legislation will expand mandatory minimums and disproportionately criminalize communities of color by imposing severe penalties on any substance chemically related to fentanyl. While Democrats still struggle to gauge the actual popularity of Trump's agenda, they need to remember there is never a mandate for cruelty. Trump's deportation incarceration regime is a constitutional and existential threat that demands fierce, unified opposition, not collaboration and capitulation. Every Democrat in Congress should oppose the HALT Fentanyl Act and the other hypercarceral bills bound to come before them in the next 4 years. And at the state level, Democratic governors should pursue mass clemencies, both as a policy prerogative to decarcerate their state prison systems and as a key strategy to protect immigrants from deportation threats. Over the next 4 years, Trump will justify his violent disposability politics by attaching the label of criminal to anyone he considers a threat. Immigrants, abortion providers, left-wing protesters, transgender people, pro-Palestine and Black Lives Matter activists, and more. Democrats will not be able to resist Trump by proposing their own forms of disposability politics and definitions of who is a criminal. Instead, they must reject the idea that people who have been marginalized or criminalized by the state are disposable and work to defend the lives and dignity of all people. It isn't just the morally right thing to do. Supporting people in communities most in need is the most successful public health and safety solution and saves taxpayer dollars to boot. Trump's January 6th pardons are evidence that his carceral politics are disconnected from public safety, and all the more reason for Democrats to reject, instead of cowing to, his accusations that they are too soft on crime. Trump has defied the law from his first day in office. He has no ground to stand on. At least one party should start embracing smart and bold policymaking that actually improves people's lives. By centering resistance to mass criminalization over the next 4 years, Democrats can show they are serious in their opposition to Trump's plans for dehumanizing and deadly state violence, and protect their most vulnerable constituents in a dangerous new era. It might even help them win an election.